Wyoming rancher bought property for $1, but the wild horse living there had a map hidden in its hoof. The wind in Laramie County has a voice of its own. It's not like the city wind that just rattles windows and pushes trash down the street. Out here, near Pine Bluffs, it speaks in long, low whispers across the prairie grass, telling tales of the folks who came before and the bones they left behind. At 52, I've spent my whole life listening to it, learning its language from the seat of a saddle, my hands calloused from fixing fences and delivering calves in the bitter cold of a Wyoming spring. This ranch isn't just land to me. It's a living history book, and every page is written in the soil my grandfather broke and my father bled for. It's in my blood, same as the iron tang of the water from our well. My companion in this life is Scout, an Australian shepherd with one blue eye and one brown, each holding a different kind of wisdom. The brown one sees the world as it is, a herd of black Angus needing to be moved, a fence post leaning after a hard winter. The blue one, though, that eye sees the things that ain't quite there, the shadow of a coyote in the tall grass, the shift in a cow's mood before she goes lame. She's more than a dog. She's an extension of my own senses, the part of me that's still wild and tethered to the pulse of this place. Our story, the one that changed everything, started not with a bang, but with a piece of paper and a $1 coin. It was a section of land bordering my west pasture, 1,000 acres of rough country that had been tied up in probate for decades. The Miller place. Old Man Miller had died without any direct heirs, and the land had sat fallow, a tangled mess of sagebrush and rock that nobody wanted. But my grandfather's ledger, a leather-bound book I kept in my office, had a strange entry from 1948. It read, "Miller's West section holds the key. Don't forget the homesteader's claim." I never knew what it meant. It was just one of those cryptic notes an old man leaves behind, a puzzle with half the pieces missing. When the county finally put the land up for auction, nobody bid. It was too remote, too rough to cultivate, and the water rights were a tangled nightmare. On the final day, I drove into Cheyenne, walked into the courthouse, and put down a bid for $1. The auctioneer, a tired man with a stained tie, banged his gavel so hard it echoed in the empty room. Just like that, I owned 1,000 acres of mystery. It felt less like a purchase and more like I was accepting a challenge from my grandfather's ghost. The first time Scout and I rode the fence line of the new property, the air was thick with the smell of pine and dry earth. It was late afternoon, and the sun cast long shadows that made the draws and coulees look deeper than they were. Scout trotted ahead of my buckskin gelding, Dusty, her nose to the ground reading the day's news, the track of a pronghorn, the scent of a badger's den. Then she froze. Her body went rigid, her tail dropped, and that blue eye of hers was fixed on something in the distance. I followed her gaze. Standing near a cluster of weathered granite outcrops was a lone mustang. He was a magnificent creature, a deep blood bay with a coat that shone like polished mahogany in the setting sun. Wild horses aren't unheard of out here, but they usually run in bands. This one was solitary, a king in his own rugged, lonely kingdom. He watched us, nostrils flaring, a quiet dignity in his stance. He wasn't scared, just cautious. "Easy there, boy," I murmured, more to my own horse than to the mustang. But Scout wasn't interested in him in the usual way. A normal herding dog would have dropped into a crouch ready to work. Scout did something else. She started circling, a wide, slow arc, never taking her eyes off the horse. She let out a low, guttural whine, a sound I'd never heard from her before. It wasn't a bark of aggression or a yip of excitement. It was a sound of confusion, of obsession. "Scout, leave it," I commanded, my voice firm. "He ain't one of ours." She ignored me. That was the first sign something was wrong. Scout never ignored a command. She lived for them. But now it was like I wasn't even there. She kept circling, her paws stirring up little puffs of red dust. The mustang stomped a foreleg, a flash of irritation, but didn't run. The two of them were locked in a silent conversation I couldn't understand. I tried again, louder this time. "Scout, heel." Nothing. She just kept her vigil, her focus absolute. Finally, I had to dismount, walk over, and physically clip a lead onto her collar to drag her away. She fought me the whole way, craning her neck to look back, whining that strange, troubled sound. The wind picked up, whispering through the sage, and for the first time standing on that piece of dollar land, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The land was trying to tell me something, and my dog was the only one who could hear it. Over the next few weeks, it became a ritual. Every time I rode out to the new section, Scout would make a beeline for that rocky outcrop. And every time, the bay mustang would be there, grazing peacefully as if he were waiting. Scout's behavior grew more frantic. She'd stop her circling and start digging, her paws tearing at the hard-packed earth near where the horse stood. She'd dig for a few minutes, then look from the hole to the horse, then to me, her blue eye blazing with an urgent message I couldn't decipher. I'd fill in the holes she'd dug, scold her for being a nuisance, and drag her away, feeling more puzzled each time. It was more than just a dog being a dog. I've worked with dogs my entire life. I know their instincts, their quirks. This was different. This was a mission. It was as if the horse and the ground beneath it held some invisible magnet, and Scout was the only compass needle that could feel its pull. My wife, Sarah, thought I was losing my mind. "Jack, she's a dog," she said one night over dinner, her voice full of gentle reason. "She probably smells a prairie dog colony under there. You're turning this into one of your grandfather's ghost stories." Our son Cody, home from college in Laramie for the summer, just smirked. "Maybe there's a dinosaur bone, Dad. You could sell it to the university and retire." I didn't dignify that with a response. They didn't see it. They weren't out there. They didn't see the look in Scout's eye or the strange, watchful stillness of that wild horse. They didn't feel the hum of history under that soil. I took another sip of my coffee and stared out the window at the darkening plains. My grandfather's words echoed in my head. "Miller's West section holds the key." Maybe the key wasn't a thing. Maybe it was a place. And maybe my dog was the only one smart enough to find the lock. My curiosity finally got the better of my common sense. One Saturday, instead of mending the fence along the highway, I told Sarah I was going to explore the old Miller place. I saddled Dusty, whistled for Scout, and rode out with a new sense of purpose. This time, I wasn't just passing through. I was investigating. Scout, sensing the shift in my mood, trotted with a new urgency, her tail held high. We headed straight for the rocky outcrops. The mustang was there, as always. He watched our approach, and for the first time, I noticed something odd about his front left hoof. It had a peculiar white marking, a sock that ran up to the fetlock and ended in a shape that looked unnervingly like a crude arrowhead, pointing down toward the ground. It was just a trick of coloration, I told myself, a random splash of white on a bay horse. But it was strange. I let Scout do her thing. She went right to her spot, a patch of ground a few yards from the horse, and started digging with a fury I'd never seen before. Instead of stopping her, I dismounted and watched. Dusty snorted, shifting his weight, his ears swiveling nervously toward the wild horse. I walked over to where Scout was digging, the dirt flying from between her hind legs. The ground was hard, packed clay mixed with stone. It was no place for a prairie dog town. I decided to help her out. I grabbed the small entrenching tool I always carry in my saddlebag and started turning over the earth. After a few minutes of grunting and sweating under the Wyoming sun, the shovel hit something that wasn't a rock. It made a dull, soft thud. My heart hammered against my ribs. I dropped to my knees and clawed at the dirt with my bare hands. Scout pushed her nose in beside me, whining with excitement. What I pulled from the ground was a small leather pouch no bigger than my hand. It was oilskin, cracked and stiff with age, the stitching rotted in places. It felt ancient. My hands trembled as I worked the hardened flap open. The mustang snorted and trotted a few paces away, but he didn't leave. He just watched, a silent guardian of this buried secret. Inside the pouch, wrapped in what felt like a scrap of old canvas, was a piece of parchment. It was yellowed and brittle, and it smelled of dust and time. I carefully unrolled it. It was a map, hand-drawn in faded ink. The lines were shaky, the writing a spidery script from a bygone era, but the landmarks were unmistakable. I saw the twin peaks we called the Sisters to the north, the winding path of Muddy Creek to the east, and a crudely drawn rock formation labeled Sentinel Rock. I knew that rock. It was on my land, a tall, lonely spire of granite on the far edge of the original Callahan homestead, right where it met the new Miller parcel. And at the base of Sentinel Rock on the map, there was an X. Beside it, a few words were scrawled in that same faded ink. Where the arrow points down. I looked from the map to the wild horse. He had lifted his front left hoof, scraping it against a rock. The white arrowhead marking seemed to glow in the sunlight. Where the arrow points down. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal instruction. This horse, this wild, solitary creature, was a living, breathing key. My grandfather's ledger, the Miller land, the horse with the marked hoof, it was all connected. A shiver ran down my spine. This was no dinosaur bone. This was something else entirely. This was a story the land had been waiting a long, long time to tell. The discovery of the map lit a fire in me. I spent the next several days riding the property, comparing the hand-drawn lines on the parchment to the actual lay of the land. It was remarkably accurate for something that had to be over 100 years old. Every draw, every creek bed, every significant rise in the terrain was there. The man who drew it knew this land like the back of his own hand. The key was Sentinel Rock. It stood on the oldest part of our ranch, a place my great-great-grandfather, Elias Callahan, had homesteaded back in the 1870s after serving in the Civil War. It was a place I knew well, a landmark we used to orient ourselves when driving cattle from the high summer pastures. But I'd never paid much attention to its base, which was a jumble of fallen scree and thick sagebrush. Before I could go charging out there with a shovel, I knew I needed more information. A map was one thing. Understanding its story was another. I started where all good mysteries in a small town begin, with the old-timers. I found Earl Hemlock holding court at the Pine Bluffs Feed and Grain, sitting on an overturned bucket and chewing on an unlit cigar. Earl was 80-something and had a memory like a steel trap, especially for gossip and local lore. I bought him a cup of coffee from the machine in the corner and showed him the map, being careful not to let anyone else see. His eyes, clouded with cataracts, squinted at the parchment. He ran a gnarled finger over the drawing of Sentinel Rock. "Well, I'll be," he rasped, his voice gravelly from a lifetime of dust and cheap cigars. "Haven't seen a drawing of that old rock in 60 years. My own granddaddy used to talk about it, called it the Scout's Marker." "The Scout's Marker?" I asked, leaning in closer. "Yep. Legend goes that back after the war between the states, there was an old Army scout who settled out this way, fella by the name of Jedediah Kane. He was with the Union cavalry tasked with protecting payroll shipments heading west. Story says one of those shipments, a big one, all gold coin, went missing somewhere between Fort Laramie and Cheyenne. Ambushed by bushwhackers, they said. But Jedediah was the only survivor, and folks always whispered he'd stashed the gold himself before the attack. My mind raced. And this has something to do with Sentinel Rock? Earl took a long, slow sip of his coffee. Jedediah homesteaded that rough patch of country that eventually became the Miller place. He was a strange one, they say, kept to himself. Had this one horse he was never without, a big bay mustang he'd apparently caught and broke himself. Said the horse was smarter than most men, and folks swore it had a mark on its hoof, a white patch shaped like an Indian arrowhead. Said Jedediah claimed the horse would always lead a man to what was rightfully his. He tapped the map. He was the scout. That was his marker. But he died of a fever before he ever told anyone where he'd hid the treasure. It just became another ghost story folks tell their kids. A bay mustang with a marked hoof. Jedediah Kane, the Miller place. It was all clicking into place, the tumblers of a century-old lock finally aligning. The wild horse out on the Miller section. It couldn't be the same one, obviously. But a descendant? Was it possible that a specific genetic trait, a marking, could be passed down through generations of wild horses that stayed in the same territory? It sounded crazy, But out here, where bloodlines in cattle and horses mean everything, it wasn't entirely impossible. Armed with a name, I spent the next afternoon at the county courthouse digging through dusty deed books. The clerk, a young woman who looked bored out of her mind, pointed me toward the archives in the basement. The air down there was thick with the smell of decaying paper and neglect. I found the original homestead filing for our land, signed by Jack Callahan, and right next to it was the filing for the adjoining property. The name on the deed was Jedediah Kane, filed in 1875. But there was something else. Stapled to the back of Kane's deed was a handwritten addendum, a mineral rights claim. It was unusual for a simple homesteader. It vaguely described a deposit of valuable metal located near a shared boundary marker with the Callahan property. The description of the location was cryptic, referencing a stone sentinel and a living guide. It was his way of legally staking his claim to the gold without revealing its location. He'd buried the treasure, then buried its secret again in plain sight, in the driest, most boring legal documents he could find. My grandfather must have stumbled upon this history, which explained the note in his ledger. He knew something was there, but he never found the final piece of the puzzle: the living guide. That night, a thunderstorm rolled in, one of those epic Wyoming squalls that makes the whole world feel like the inside of a drum. Rain hammered against the roof and lightning lit up the plains in stark, flashing detail. Sarah and Cody were watching a movie, but I couldn't sit still. I was in my office, the map spread out on my desk under the glow of a single lamp, the old deeds beside it. Scout was lying at my feet, her head on her paws, but she was restless, whining softly every time the thunder cracked. A pair of headlights cut through the deluge, turning into our lane. I wasn't expecting anyone. I went to the door and saw a mud-splattered Ford F-250 pull up. The door opened, and a large figure in a yellow slicker emerged. It was my neighbor, Earl Thompson. Earl and I were not friends. Our families had ranched side by side for 3 generations, but there was always a current of bad blood between us, mostly over water rights and fence lines. He was a man who believed the only good neighbor was one you could get something over on. "Jack," he grunted, shaking the rain off his hat on the porch. "Got a minute?" "It's late, Earl. What's on your mind?" He pushed past me into the entryway, his eyes scanning the house before settling on me. "I hear you bought the old Miller place." "News travels fast," I said, my voice flat. "It does," he said, a slow, unpleasant smile spreading across his face. "Funny thing is, my lawyer was doing some research for me on another matter, and he came across something interesting. Seems my great-uncle sold a portion of our original property to Miller back in the day, but he filed a quitclaim deed on it. A reversionary clause. Means if the property ever left the Miller family line, ownership was supposed to revert back to us. The county auction was a mistake. That land is mine, Jack." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "I don't know anything about that, Earl. I bought it fair and square. Paperwork says otherwise," he sneered. "I'm filing a formal challenge tomorrow. I just thought I'd be neighborly and let you know you're trespassing. Stay off my property." He turned and left without another word, disappearing back into the storm. I stood there, the screen door slapping shut in the wind, the sound of the rain mixing with the furious pounding in my ears. It all made sense now. Earl wasn't just being a difficult neighbor. He knew. He must have heard the same legends, found some piece of the puzzle himself, and was now making a play for the land and whatever was hidden on it. The treasure hunt was over. This was now a fight for my family's legacy. And as I looked down at Scout, who had risen to her feet and was growling low in her chest at the door Earl had just exited, I knew it was a fight I wasn't going to lose. The land had chosen me and my dog to uncover its secret, and I'd be damned if I was going to let a snake like Earl Thompson steal it. The next morning the world was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind the sweet, earthy smell of rain on sagebrush and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. But the beauty of the morning did little to calm the storm raging inside me. Earl Thompson's threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He'd have his lawyers file the papers, and the whole thing would get tangled up in a legal mess that could drag on for years, bleeding me dry. My $1 investment was about to cost me everything. I knew I couldn't fight him on his terms. in a courtroom filled with men in suits who didn't know the difference between a Hereford and an Angus. I had to fight him on my terms, with the truth, and the truth was buried at the base of Sentinel Rock. The map and the journal weren't just clues to a treasure, they were my proof. They were the story of this land, a story that predated any quitclaim deed Earl's crooked lawyer could dig up. "Sarah," I said over breakfast, my voice tight, "I'm going out to Sentinel Rock. I think I know how to end this." She looked at me, her fork hovering over her plate. The skepticism was gone from her eyes, replaced by a worried resolve. "Be careful, Jack." Cody, who had overheard Earl's visit the night before, pushed his chair back. "I'm going with you, Dad." He looked at me, his youthful arrogance replaced by a steely determination that reminded me of my own father. "This is our land, too." I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. "All right, let's go." We took the pickup as far as we could, then saddled the horses for the last few miles. Scout ran ahead, a black and white blur of joyful purpose, as if she knew today was the day her strange obsession would finally be understood. The air was cool and clear as we rode toward the towering rock formation. It rose out of the prairie like a granite fist shaking at the sky, a landmark for generations of men who had worked this land. As we got closer, I saw him. The bay mustang. He was standing right where the map indicated, near the jumbled pile of rocks at the base of the spire. He watched us approach, his stance calm, almost welcoming. He wasn't a wild animal anymore. He was a gatekeeper. We dismounted and walked the final 100 yards. I approached the horse slowly, my hands held out, speaking in a low, steady voice. He didn't move. He just watched me with those dark, intelligent eyes. I looked down at his front left hoof. The arrowhead marking was clear as day, a perfect natural brand. He lifted his foot and set it down again, almost delicately, right on a patch of bare earth between two large boulders. Where the arrow points down. "This is it," I whispered to Cody. I took the shovels from my saddle. "Let's get to work." Scout didn't need to be told. She was already digging, her body trembling with excitement. Cody and I joined in, our shovels biting into the damp earth. The work was hard. The ground was choked with rocks and roots. But we worked with a frantic energy, fueled by adrenaline and a century of anticipation. After nearly an hour of digging, my shovel struck something metal with a loud, jarring clang that vibrated up my arms. "Dad!" Cody yelled. "You hit something." We dropped to our knees, scraping away the last of the dirt with our hands. It was the corner of an iron box, rusted and pitted with age. It was about 2 feet long and a foot wide, heavy and immovable. It took both of us grunting and straining to haul it out of the hole. There was a heavy, rusted lock on the front, but the hinges had long since corroded. With a crowbar from my saddlebag and a few solid whacks, the lid groaned open. The sight stole the breath from my lungs. The box was filled with canvas sacks, each one stamped with the seal of the U.S. Treasury. I untied the drawstring on one of them. It was full of gold coins, double eagles minted in the 1860s, each one gleaming in the morning sun as if it had been minted yesterday. It was real. The legend was real. But underneath the bags of gold was something even more valuable. It was another oilskin pouch, and inside was a thick leather journal. The first page was inscribed in the same spidery script as the map. The Journal of Elias Callahan, 1st Sergeant, U.S. Cavalry. My great-great-grandfather, not Jedediah Kane. My hands shook as I turned the brittle pages. The story that unfolded was one of duty, desperation, and honor. Elias Callahan and Jedediah Kane had served together. They were friends, brothers in arms. On that fateful day, it was Elias, not Jedediah, who was in charge of the payroll. When they were ambushed, Jedediah was killed, but Elias managed to escape with the gold and his trusted horse, a bay mustang with an arrowhead marking on its hoof. Fearing the raiders would return, and with no way to get the gold safely back to the fort, Elias buried it. He created the map and devised the plan with the mineral rights claim. But he was a man of honor. It wasn't his money. It belonged to the government. His journal was a meticulous record of his attempts to contact the War Department, to return what he had protected. But in the chaos following the war, his letters went unanswered. He grew old, waiting for an answer that never came. He passed the story to his son, my great-grandfather, making him swear to protect the gold until the family could legally and honorably claim it. And the secret was passed down, becoming more legend than fact, until it landed in my grandfather's ledger as a cryptic clue. Jedediah Kane, the famous scout, had become a cover story, a piece of local folklore to protect the real secret. The journal also detailed the boundary agreement he'd made with the original Thompson homesteader. It included a signed affidavit from both men, clearly stating that the mineral claim tied to Sentinel Rock belonged solely to the Callahan homestead. Earl Thompson's quitclaim deed was a fraud, a twisted interpretation of a completely different land transaction. I looked up from the journal, my eyes blurry with tears. This wasn't just about gold. This was about my family's name, about an honorable man who had done his duty and spent his life protecting a secret. This journal was my weapon. It was the truth, written in faded ink. Just then, we heard the sound of an engine. 2 trucks were bouncing across the prairie toward us. One was Earl Thompson's Ford. The other was the Laramie County Sheriff's vehicle. Earl climbed out of his truck, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Well, well, Jack. Looks like I caught you red-handed. Digging on my land. Sheriff, I want him arrested for trespassing and theft." Sheriff Brody, a good man I'd known my whole life, walked over, his face grim. "Jack, what's going on here? Earl filed a complaint this morning." I didn't say a word. I just stood up, holding the open journal. "Sheriff," I said, my voice steady, "I think you need to read this." I handed him the journal. He took it, his brow furrowed in confusion. Earl started to protest, but Brody held up a hand to silence him. He began to read, his eyes moving slowly across the pages. He read about the ambush, the buried gold, the honorable soldier trying to do the right thing. He read the sworn affidavit about the boundary line, signed by both of our ancestors. The silence was broken only by the wind whistling around Sentinel Rock. The bay mustang stood nearby, a silent observer to the final act of a play that had started over a century ago. When Brody finished reading, he slowly closed the journal and looked at Earl Thompson. The smirk was gone from Earl's face, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed shock. "Earl," the sheriff said, his voice cold as a winter morning. "This journal, along with the original homestead filings, proves that this land and everything in it has belonged to the Callahan family since 1875. Your quitclaim deed is based on a fraudulent interpretation of an unrelated agreement. In fact, it looks a lot like you've been trying to use a bogus legal document to steal your neighbor's property." He let that hang in the air for a moment. "I suggest you get in your truck and go home before I decide to open an investigation into fraud." Earl stared at him, then at me, his face a mask of pure, impotent rage. He didn't say a word. He just turned, got in his truck, and tore off across the prairie, leaving a cloud of dust and humiliation in his wake. Sheriff Brody looked at the open box of gold, then at me and Cody. He shook his head and let out a low whistle. "Jack," he said, a slow grin spreading across his face, "you Callahans sure know how to keep a secret." He looked over at Scout, who was sitting proudly beside me, thumping her tail against the ground. "And you'd better give that dog an extra steak tonight." The story of the Callahan gold spread through Laramie County faster than a prairie fire. It wasn't just gossip. It was the birth of a new local legend. Our family name, which had always been associated with hard work and quiet perseverance, was now linked to a tale of Civil War honor, hidden treasure, and a ghost horse that wasn't a ghost at all. The gold, after being properly declared and taxed, was more than enough to secure our ranch for generations to come. But we didn't just hoard it. We set up a historical preservation fund for Pine Bluffs, restored the old church steeple, and created a scholarship at the local high school. The treasure, we decided, belonged to the community as much as it did to us. It was a piece of our shared history, brought back into the light. The biggest change, though, was on the ranch itself. the cloud of financial worry that hangs over every ranching family, the fear of drought, falling cattle prices, the relentless pressure to sell out to developers, was lifted. We could breathe. We could plan for the future instead of just surviving the present. Cody, who had been planning on a career in agricultural business far from home, decided to stay. The discovery hadn't just uncovered gold, it had uncovered his own deep-seated connection to this land. He saw it now not as a burden but as a legacy he was proud to inherit. To celebrate, and to honor the land and the ancestors who had watched over it, we threw the biggest branding party the county had ever seen. The whole town came out. We set up long tables under the cottonwoods by the creek, and the air was filled with the smell of barbecue, the sound of a local country band, and the laughter of neighbors. It felt like more than a party. It felt like a healing. The old feuds and petty disputes seemed to melt away in the face of a story so much bigger than any one of us. During a lull in the festivities, I walked away from the crowd and leaned against the corral fence, watching the calves get worked. Scout came and sat beside me, leaning her weight against my leg. I looked out across the west pasture toward the Miller place, the Callahan place now. In the distance, I could see the bay mustang grazing peacefully on a hillside. He was part of the ranch now, a wild and free symbol of our history. I had no intention of ever trying to fence him in. Some things are meant to remain untamed. I scratched Scout behind the ears right in her favorite spot. Her blue eye looked up at me, and in its depths, I saw a reflection of the vast Wyoming sky. She had been the key, the one creature whose instincts were pure enough to hear a story 100 years old, whispered on the wind. She hadn't been looking for gold. She had been drawn to the history, to the unresolved energy of a secret kept for too long. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the plains in shades of orange and purple, a profound sense of peace settled over me. This land, this sprawling, rugged piece of America, wasn't just a place to raise cattle. It was a repository of memories, of honor, of love and loss. It held the stories of everyone who had ever walked on it, bled on it, and laid their bones to rest in it. The land remembers. And if you're quiet enough, if you're patient enough, and if you're lucky enough to have a companion as loyal and true as Scout, sometimes it lets you remember too. The greatest treasure we found that day wasn't the gold in the box, but the truth in that journal, a truth that rooted my family to this place forever. And as I watched the last sliver of sun disappear, I knew, deep in my soul, that we were finally home.